She stood in line with calm in her breath and quiet power in her stance, the hum of the terminal buzzing around her like static, but her focus locked on the boarding gate ahead. Row 1. Priority access. Her black trench coat was buttoned to the collar, her posture poised, and by her side sat a sleek, black Labrador with a service harness, motionless and alert. The leash wrapped gently around her wrist, her fingers resting lightly on the dog's head, radiating quiet confidence. But the stares had already begun. One by one, people turned to look, some curious, others judgmental, a few outright disturbed by the sight of a black woman in first-class boarding, dressed with elegance but no designer logo in sight, and a service dog that looked too clean, too trained, too dignified to be real in their eyes. The whispers came quickly, bleeding from lips that never knew silence. She has a dog? Is that allowed up there? Maybe she's someone's assistant. One man clutched his briefcase tighter as she stepped forward. Another woman pulled her child subtly behind her. It wasn't said aloud, but it didn't need to be. She didn't fit their picture. She didn't match the mold they'd built in their minds of who belonged at the front of the plane. And the moment the white flight attendant appeared at the gate, all that silent prejudice found its voice. "Excuse me," the attendant said, her eyes narrowing on the leash, not the passenger. "This dog, do you have proof he's cleared for the cabin? We don't allow emotional support animals in first class." Her voice was syrup-sweet, the kind that drips slow but cuts sharp. The woman calmly held out her documentation. The attendant barely glanced. "Are you sure this isn't for coach? First class is already full." The tension cracked like ice beneath thin boots. The woman tilted her head, eyes unflinching. "That's my seat. 1A. The attendant blinked, visibly thrown. "There must be a mistake. Did you get upgraded by someone?" she asked, louder now, just enough for others in line to hear. A chuckle from behind, a whispered, "Unbelievable." Still, the woman said nothing. The dog at her side didn't twitch. They were a matched pair of dignity under fire. But behind the gate's sleek monitor, something shifted. A name lit up on the crew's internal manifest, linked to her booking. A name the flight attendant hadn't noticed before. A name she didn't understand, not yet. And in that moment, as the jet bridge door opened with a hiss and boarding began, everything she thought she knew about who this woman was would soon collapse. Because someone up front had already vouched for her. Someone whose name everyone would recognize. But for now, the air was thick, the judgment sharper than the recycled oxygen in the terminal. And the woman simply took one step forward, her dog moving in perfect harmony toward the plane, the insult still echoing behind her like a shadow. The air inside the plane was cooler, sharper, sterile in a way that made the tension feel even more suffocating as she stepped past the threshold. Her footsteps soundless, her dog silently gliding beside her. But the pressure behind her eyes grew, heavier with every second, because even here, even in the space she'd paid for, she was already being measured, judged, doubted. The moment she crossed the curtain into first class, the heads turned like clockwork, white faces peering over armrests, and from behind glossy headsets, some with vague confusion, others with open disdain, and none of them pretending to hide it. Not when the flight attendant from the gate was now trailing her steps like a shadow that refused to let go. Her voice, sharper now, more performative. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to confirm your boarding pass one more time, just for protocol." And the word protocol hung in the air like an excuse dipped in authority. But it was only her being singled out, only her, being questioned again while other passengers waltzed past unbothered, greeted with smiles and glasses of champagne. The woman turned slowly, handed her boarding pass over once more without a word, and the attendant, faking a smile, scanned it and blinked when the screen flashed a green confirmation that read, 1A, VIP clearance, do not move. But instead of stepping back, she muttered just loudly enough, "They're just letting anyone up here now." And her eyes flicked to the dog. "Does it bite?" And that earned a stifled chuckle from a man in 1C who leaned toward the aisle, sneering, "Hope it doesn't shed too much on the seats," as if he'd said something clever. The woman kept walking, because she'd learned long ago that dignity was the armor they couldn't take from you unless you handed it over. But her silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation, control, survival, because every second she sat in that seat would be a silent rebellion against the roles they tried to script for, people like her. When she reached 1A, she gently guided the dog into a perfect downstay position, her every motion careful, exact, as the white woman across the aisle in 1B shifted uncomfortably, pulled her shawl tighter, and pretended not to stare. A new flight attendant approached. This one younger, trying to smile but clearly tense, and asked with a nervous laugh, "Do you have someone with you today?" And the question echoed with implication, as if she were a guest, not a guest of her own merit, as if surely she wasn't traveling alone, because what kind of black woman sits in 1A with a dog trained better than most people's children? But again, she just nodded once and said calmly, "No, just me and him," and looked down at the dog, who remained still, unaffected, as if trained to ignore the weight of racism too. The cabin began to fill, and slowly the whispers spread like wildfire, like a question no one wanted to say aloud, but kept passing in low tones. Who is she? Did you see how she got treated? Maybe she's someone important, but she doesn't look like it. And the thing was, it didn't matter how she looked. It didn't matter how straight her posture was, how expensive her coat might be, how perfectly behaved her dog was. To them, her skin always said less, always said, prove it, always said, you're not supposed to be here. And as she sat back in her seat, head held high, chin level, she could feel the judgment swirl around her like turbulence before the takeoff, but she didn't blink, because she already knew what they didn't. This wasn't the end of the insult. It was only the beginning. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the silence around seat 1A felt almost weaponized. Quiet, yes, but charged with a stiffness that made every breath feel watched, as if the very air she inhaled had been deemed unworthy by those around her. Across the aisle, a man with slicked back hair and a silver tie shifted in his seat, glanced her way, then down at her dog, and gave a thin, practiced smile that didn't touch his eyes before turning back to his tablet without a word. But his body, language, tight shoulders, a deliberate lean away, said enough. Behind her, soft murmurs rose and fell, fragments of sentences dripping with assumption. I just didn't expect her in this section. Do you think she used points? Maybe she's with someone who actually flies. And though no one said it directly, the message was crystal clear. She was out of place, an uninvited presence in their floating lounge of privilege, and the flight attendant from the gate, the one who'd questioned her twice, already wasn't done. She returned minutes later with a tray of drinks, her steps calculated, her eyes flicking quickly past the woman in 1A, as if her seat were empty, offering champagne and warm towels to the passengers beside her while skipping over her completely, then turning and walking off as if the omission were nothing, as if it were routine, and perhaps it was, for people like her. The woman said nothing, didn't flinch, but the tightness in her chest tightened another notch, and her hand dropped silently to rest on her dog's back, grounding herself in that one point of calm, while the world conspired to erase her. Turbulence rattled through the cabin, and seatbelt signs lit up with a beep. But what shook her more wasn't the movement of the plane. It was the moment the woman in 1B leaned across the armrest and whispered with a sugary edge, "I assume your dog is house-trained?" Not because she cared, but because she wanted to remind her that she didn't belong, that her presence had to be explained, justified, contained. And when the woman simply nodded, offering no satisfaction, the passenger scoffed under her breath and pulled her feet up onto her seat as if fearing contamination. The service dog didn't react, didn't move an inch, well-trained, focused, patient. But the woman could feel her own control fraying with every minute, every word not said, every expression not returned. The flight continued, meal service rolled out, and once again, she was passed, over. No tray, no menu, just silence and the clang of dishes being handed out around her, while the white flight attendant finally glanced at her and said, "Oh, I didn't know you wanted a meal," as if eating was something optional for black passengers. In first class, as if hunger only came with a certain skin tone or status level. And when the woman replied softly, "I believe it comes with the seat," the attendant offered a tight, thin smile and said, "I'll check if there's anything left," before walking off without apology, without shame. She heard it then. Someone behind her muttering, "Entitlement gets you nowhere." And she didn't know if it was meant for her, but she felt it settle like a stone on her spine all the same. Every interaction on that flight wasn't just about her seat. It was about power, about perception, about a room full of people quietly agreeing that no matter what her boarding pass said, she hadn't earned it in their eyes, and maybe never could. And yet she sat there, unmoving, unbroken, because her silence wasn't surrender. It was resistance sharpened to a blade. They didn't know who she was, and they didn't care. But she did, and soon enough, they'd realize that the woman they tried to ignore was the only one they should have been watching. Let's take a brief pause in the story. Tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced or witnessed something like this in real life? We truly want to hear your voice. And if this story speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. Now we continue. The moment the cabin lights dimmed and the seatbelt sign blinked off, the whispers sharpened like blades in the air around her. Low murmurs traded behind menus and clinking glasses, and though none of it was said directly to her face, every syllable carved a mark deeper than the one before. She must be a guest of someone. Do you think she actually paid for that seat? Probably some influencer playing the victim card. And the worst part wasn't the cruelty itself. It was how routine it all felt, how confidently they spoke around her as if she weren't there at all, as if her presence in first class had broken some unspoken code. And still, the same flight attendant kept circling back with forced professionalism so thin it was almost satire, this time crouching near her seat with a small clipboard and asking, "Miss, I just want to confirm that this dog is truly certified, and you're aware that emotional pets aren't normally allowed in row 1 due to allergy protocols from other passengers." But there were no complaints, no allergies, only assumptions, only invented rules wrapped in careful phrasing. And when the woman calmly replied, "He's a service dog, fully licensed. I've submitted all forms twice," the attendant's eyes flicked sideways and she muttered, "Understood." But her tone said otherwise. Barely tolerated, not welcomed, not respected. Another glass of wine was offered to the passenger in 1C, then 1B. But her tray remained empty, and though she hadn't asked, again, it was clear. This was denial through neglect, a punishment for taking up space in a seat meant for someone more fitting. Her dog remained motionless, pressed against her boots, steady as stone, but her grip on the armrest tightened as a man. Returning from the lavatory, leaned in just slightly, eyes scanning her from head to toe before saying under his breath, "Funny, you don't look like someone who usually flies up here," then walked away without waiting for a reaction, like he'd dropped a truth that needed no answer. The woman didn't flinch, but her jaw ached from holding back every word she wanted to spit into that stale, privileged air. Because she'd paid, she belonged. She was every bit entitled to the seat she occupied, but entitlement looked different when it had her skin tone. It looked like intrusion, like trouble, like defiance. A young boy from the row behind peeked between the seats, staring at her dog with innocent fascination, and asked his mother, "Can I pet the puppy?" But the mother gently pulled him back and whispered just loud enough, "Don't get too close." And the implication wrapped around the child's curiosity like a leash made of fear. Every breath, every moment, every minute on that plane felt like a test. How much could she endure without reacting? How many layers of quiet racism could they pile on before she cracked? And still, she sat tall, still, silent, unreadable, until it happened. The cockpit door opened, and out stepped the captain, tall, calm, professional. And as he scanned the cabin, His eyes stopped on her, and something shifted. He walked straight to her seat, leaned slightly, and said in a voice that carried enough volume to cut through the silence, "Thank you again for flying with us today, ma'am. Your friend made it very clear how important it was we take care of you personally." She nodded, her face calm, but inside the tremor cracked through her spine because now the atmosphere changed, now heads turned. Now the question became not why is she here, but who is she? Because someone had vouched for her from the front. Someone powerful enough to make even the pilot leave the cockpit to greet her in person. And suddenly, the same people who had sneered and whispered now shifted uncomfortably. In their seats, the unspoken cast they'd built cracking beneath the weight of a name. None of them knew, but now feared had more power than their assumptions. The rest of the flight was filled with a strange tension, one that had been carefully woven into the air, but was now cracking, piece by piece, under the pressure of the unspoken. As the plane cruised in the quiet hum of altitude, the whispers slowed. But not because the passengers had suddenly realized the injustice of their assumptions. No, the quiet was filled with something more unsettling. Fear. Fear of what had just happened. Fear of who this woman actually was. Fear of the unspoken truth, now spreading through the cabin like a virus. The flight attendant had returned to her station, her movements rigid, but no longer as dismissive. She had offered a half-hearted apology earlier, a brief glance of discomfort that lasted all of 3 seconds before she continued her rounds. But the woman could feel the shift. She had not been acknowledged just as a paying passenger or a rightful first-class occupant. She had been acknowledged as something more, something that had caused the walls around the other passengers to tremble. It was as if, in one brief moment, the illusion they had held about who deserved to be there had shattered. Her presence was no longer a question of privilege, but one of power. And as the captain's words echoed in her mind, she realized the passengers were beginning to understand that power. As the turbulence began to settle and the plane entered its steady course, the man in 1C, who had previously sneered at her presence, shifted nervously in his seat. His face had been flushed with discomfort ever since the captain had walked away. But now, it seemed even more contorted, his lips tight, his gaze flicking between the flight attendant and the woman in 1A. His attempt to return to his movie seemed futile. The tension in the air was too palpable, too suffocating. For the first time, the woman noticed that there was a hint of fear behind his otherwise arrogant facade. He knew something was wrong, and he couldn't escape it. She didn't look at him directly. She didn't need to, but she could feel the discomfort radiating from him, feel the silent apology in his every gesture, his fidgeting hands that had once been so sure of themselves. But now they could barely hold onto his wine glass without shaking. She didn't care about his regret, though. She didn't need his remorse. What she needed was to sit in peace, to exist in this space, without the constant reminder that she was other, that she was always going to be other in a room full of people who believed their place was guaranteed, and hers had to be earned. The woman had never sought out power in the way others did. She had always kept her head down, focused on getting through the day with as little confrontation as possible. But now, she realized, she was no longer playing by the rules they had set. They saw her as a threat, not because of her behavior, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was. Her very existence was a challenge to their assumptions. The man in 1C shifted again, his eyes glancing at the attendant, then back to her. He seemed to gather himself, as if working up the nerve to say something, and finally, he spoke. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice tight, too formal. "I didn't mean to offend you earlier. I didn't know who you were." The words, so forced and insincere, cut through the air like glass. His apology was shallow, drenched in the kind of politeness that people like him used to maintain their facade of kindness while still trying to assert dominance. She could tell he was uncomfortable with the apology, uncomfortable with the fact that his prejudices had been exposed. But still, it was the first time he had acknowledged her directly, the first time he had attempted to engage with her in a way that was at least trying to be respectful. The woman didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. She had heard this kind of apology before. Empty, transactional. It wasn't real. It wasn't enough. But she didn't need to say anything either. She simply gave him a brief glance, allowing him to sit in the weight of his own discomfort, before returning her gaze to the window, staring at the endless stretch of clouds below, her thoughts quiet, her mind focused. But the man in 1C wasn't done. He cleared his throat. Then, as if to reclaim some of the power he had just lost, added, "I just didn't realize how things worked up here, you know. I mean, I'm used to seeing people like you in economy, but not up here. I've been flying this route for years, and I've never seen anything like this before." The words stung in a way he couldn't understand. People like you in economy. He had meant it, but he hadn't meant for it to sound so exact, so deliberate. To him, she wasn't just a person. She was an anomaly, a blip in the well-oiled machine of a system that had always kept people like him in the front while people like her stayed at the back. But she didn't need to explain that to him. She didn't need to make him understand. What she did need, however, was to make it clear that his ignorance wasn't her responsibility. "I'm not your anomaly," she said, her voice low, but clear enough for him to hear. "I'm not here because of some mistake. I'm not here because someone else made a decision for me. I'm here because I paid for this seat, because I earned it, not because of what you think I should be." For a moment, the man said nothing. He simply sat there, processing her words, and she could tell that, for the first time, the layers of his prejudice were being peeled back. He was realizing that his view of the world, his worldview, wasn't just flawed, it was broken, and he didn't know how to respond to it. He couldn't deny what he had seen, what he had heard, and that shook him. The woman didn't wait for him to reply. She didn't care about his apology anymore. The damage was done. What mattered now was her own peace, her own strength. She had found it not in the validation of others, but in the realization that no one could take her place. No one could tell her where she belonged. She had earned that, and she would hold on to it. As the flight continued, the murmurs in the cabin started to die down, as if the collective realization that something had changed hovered in the air, weighing heavily on every passenger. The woman remained in her seat, silent but unbroken, knowing that no amount of discomfort from the people around her would ever change her right to be there. But even as the hours passed and the flight neared its destination, the boy who had been quietly observing all of this from the row behind 1A, who had watched his mother rise in the face of contempt and unspoken racism, knew something had shifted for him as well. He had never seen her this way before, so poised, so strong, and in that moment, he felt something stir within him, something that told him that he too would never allow himself to shrink, never again allow his place to be questioned. They were almost there. The turbulence of the flight had subsided, but the turbulence of their lives, the lives of everyone on that plane, was just beginning, and in a few hours, the world would see the change that had already begun within the woman in 1A. The shift in the dynamic, in the balance of power, was unstoppable. No longer could she be dismissed as someone beneath them, and for everyone watching, for everyone who had ever wondered if they truly belonged, the fight had just begun. As the plane descended towards its destination, the woman felt a subtle shift in the air, a change that she had been expecting, but was now undeniable. The uncomfortable glances had slowed down, the whispers muted, but the tension still clung to the air like a thick fog. She could feel it everywhere, as if the entire plane had taken a collective breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the unspoken truth that had been hovering just below the surface to finally erupt. She wasn't naive enough to believe that everything had suddenly changed. No, the world was far more insidious than that. This was just a brief moment, a blip in the system, but it was one that she would never forget. The man in 1C who had apologized earlier still hadn't said another word to her. He sat there now, staring straight ahead, his fingers drumming nervously against his armrest. He could feel it too, the weight of his own ignorance, the weight of his assumptions that had been shattered in a matter of minutes. He had been forced to confront the lie he had been living, the lie that told him that people like her didn't belong where he did, that her presence in that seat was some kind of mistake. He had been forced to face the truth that people like him didn't get to decide who belonged and who didn't. But even now, as he looked out the window, Avoiding her gaze, she could tell that he wasn't truly sorry. His apology had been nothing more than a desperate attempt to maintain control over the situation, to pretend that everything could go back to normal once the plane landed. But nothing would ever be the same again. The woman's thoughts were interrupted by the flight attendant, who had returned to her row, this time with a tight smile that seemed even more strained than before. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice still dripping with forced politeness. "I just wanted to confirm that everything is okay with you and your seat. If there's anything we can do to make your experience more comfortable." The woman didn't respond immediately. She looked at the attendant, who seemed almost apologetic. But the woman could see the underlying hesitation, the fear that lurked just beneath the surface. The attendant wasn't apologizing for her actions, for the way she had treated her, but for something else, something more profound. She had realized, just like everyone else on this flight, that this woman wasn't just another entitled passenger. She was a challenge. She was a symbol of everything that the system wasn't prepared to acknowledge, and everything it feared. "I'm fine," the woman said softly, her voice calm but resolute. "Thank you for checking, but I don't need anything." The flight attendant hesitated before nodding, her eyes flicking nervously to the side, as if she had seen something she couldn't quite understand. "Of course, ma'am," she said, her voice quieter now, as if she was speaking to someone on a different level, someone who was beyond her reach. The woman sat back in her seat, allowing the final descent to unfold in silence. The dog at her feet remained still, her companion in this strange, charged atmosphere that now enveloped them both. She had learned long ago that silence was often the loudest form of resistance, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to let her silence speak for her. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt signs blinked off, the woman was one of the first to rise, gathering her belongings with deliberate calm. She could feel the eyes on her again, but this time it was different. This time, they weren't filled with judgment. No, this time there was something else, a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, and something else she couldn't quite place. As she made her way down the aisle, she could feel their eyes on her, but this time, it wasn't a weight on her shoulders. It was a reflection of everything they had failed to see, everything they had dismissed as unimportant. When she reached the door, the same captain who had spoken to her earlier stood there, waiting for her. He gave her a brief nod of acknowledgement, his earlier formality gone, replaced by something else. Respect, perhaps, or at least recognition of the quiet battle she had just won. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her, the way he straightened as she passed, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This was about something bigger, something that transcended their small, insular world of first-class cabins and social status. This was about the right to exist in spaces that weren't built for people like her. The right to claim her place in a world that kept trying to erase her. She stepped off the plane, the cool air of the airport greeting her like an old friend, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of the world shift. She had survived the flight, but more than that, she had made a statement that couldn't be ignored. A statement that said, "I belong here." And though she knew the world would never fully understand the power of that statement, it didn't matter, because she knew who she was now, and no one, no matter how hard they tried, would ever make her feel small again. But as she walked through the terminal, the phone in her pocket buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. She hesitated for a moment, then unlocked her phone and opened the message. "It's not over. Keep going. They need to hear your voice." The woman's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the message for what it was, a call to action, a reminder that this battle, this fight for recognition, was far from over. But it was the first time someone had reached out to her, someone who understood that silence was not enough, that her story needed to be told. She tucked the phone away and took a deep breath. The path ahead would not be easy. It would be filled with more battles, more prejudice, more subtle insults that came not from the words people said, but from the way they looked at her. But for the first time, she didn't feel like she was walking alone, and that gave her more strength than she had ever known. The world would see her now. They would hear her, and nothing would stop her from speaking her truth. As she walked through the terminal, the weight of the world seemed to shift with every step she took. But the battle inside her chest was far from over. The space was still filled with the ghosts of the judgmental glances from the flight, the lingering echoes of whispered insults and sideways glances that no one had dared say aloud. She could feel their eyes on her, as if their silent prejudices were following her like an invisible chain, an unspoken force trying to pull her back to the place where she didn't belong, where she wasn't welcome. But today, she wasn't going to let them win. Her mind was racing with a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline. She had just spent hours on a flight, fighting for her seat, fighting for her right to exist in a space that was never meant for her. But she had made it through. She had shown them that she could not be erased. But there was a part of her, a small voice that kept whispering in the back of her mind, that told her she wasn't finished. She wasn't done yet. As she passed through the airport, she noticed the stares from people who passed by. Some of them tried to hide their curiosity, but it was obvious. They saw her, but they didn't truly see her. She was an anomaly, something they hadn't expected to encounter in their world of privilege and comfort. She could feel their judgment seeping into the very air around her, but this time it didn't matter. She had already earned the right to be here, to exist in this space. It didn't matter what they thought. What mattered was what she knew. She walked with a confidence she hadn't felt in a long time, though the weight of their unspoken thoughts pressed heavily on her chest. She had gotten through that flight. She had made her statement, and in some ways, it had shaken the foundation of what they had thought was an unshakable social order. But that wasn't enough. She had made it this far, but there was more to be done. There were more eyes to face, more voices to silence, and more battles to be won. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had ever been made to feel less than. She made her way through the terminal, eyes scanning the crowd for any familiar faces. She hadn't expected to feel the weight of those eyes so deeply, but they were everywhere. She could hear the whispers behind her, the hushed tones that came with curiosity mixed with unease. There was always a whisper when someone like her dared to take up space in a place that had been reserved for people like them. But the thing they didn't realize was that she wasn't just taking up space, she was owning it. She was moving through a world that wasn't built for her, but it was a world that she had every right to exist in. No one had the right to take that away from her. Not the passengers who whispered, not the flight attendant who questioned her presence, not anyone. As she made her way to the baggage claim, she passed by a group of women talking in the corner, their laughter louder than it needed to be. But still, she could hear them. One of them, a tall woman in a sharply cut suit, looked at her for a moment too long before turning to her friend. "I can't believe they're letting anyone in first class these days," the woman said, her voice loud enough to reach the woman's ears. "It's like they're just handing out VIP tickets to anyone with a pulse." The words cut through the air like a blade, and for a moment, the woman's heart froze. She had heard these kinds of comments before, but this time, they stung deeper. It wasn't just the comment itself, it was the way it was said, the way it assumed that she didn't belong. She had earned that seat. She had every right to be there, but to these women, she was nothing more than an intruder, an outsider in a space they thought was theirs by divine right. She could feel her grip on her suitcase tighten, the weight of their judgment pushing against her. But she didn't stop. She didn't let their words slow her down. Instead, she walked faster, her steps firm, her chin raised. The world wasn't going to change by waiting for it to be kinder. The world would change when people like her refused to back down, when they refused to let others define their place. She wasn't going to be their side note. She wasn't going to be their afterthought. As she reached the baggage carousel, she saw the same woman from the flight, her seatmate in 1C, standing with her husband near the claim area. The woman's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was that same flash of discomfort. The woman quickly looked away, her hand tightening on the arm of her husband as if to avoid any further confrontation. But the woman wasn't interested in making eye contact. She had learned the hard way that some people weren't worth confronting. They didn't want to change. They didn't want to see her as anything more than a pawn in a game they were playing. The woman glanced at the couple, her gaze steady, but there was no satisfaction in her expression. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. She wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to exist, to breathe, to take up space. And no one, no matter how high their status, was going to take that from her. She watched as the baggage claim spun and her suitcase finally appeared. She grabbed it with one fluid motion, the weight of the bag grounding her even as her emotions threatened to rise again. She knew this was only the beginning. There would be more encounters like this, more moments where people would try to silence her, more moments where she would have to prove her worth. But she was done proving herself to people who didn't see her. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need them to understand her journey. All she needed was herself. As she walked out of the airport, the cool evening air hit her face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of calm. She'd made it through that flight, and she would make it through the rest of the world too. She would carve her own path, not because she had to, but because she deserved it. And if the world didn't want to accept her, then it was time for the world to change. She was done waiting for permission. She was done shrinking herself for the comfort of others. She would rise. She would speak. She would make them hear her. And no one, no matter how many of them there were, could stop her. The days following her encounter on the plane seemed to stretch on endlessly, yet they were filled with a familiar discomfort. It wasn't just the stares she had endured, nor the whispered comments that followed her everywhere she went. It was the feeling of being invisible, and yet constantly under scrutiny. It was the subtle, constant reminder that her presence, her very existence in certain spaces, was never truly accepted, no matter what she accomplished, no matter how much she earned. She had always known that the world was built for people who looked like everyone else on the plane, the ones who had never been made to fight for their place. But that realization hadn't made the sting of rejection any less sharp. The woman, now well aware that her own power was being tested every time she stepped out into the world, found herself replaying every single moment of that flight, every glance that had crossed her path, every judgment cast her way. She thought about the way the flight attendants had treated her, how they had spoken over her, barely acknowledging her presence, as if she were invisible. She thought about the way the passengers had treated her, the laughter and the sideways glances, the questions about how someone like her had made it into a seat like that. But what hurt more than anything was the realization that this wasn't the first time she had been made to feel like she didn't belong. It wouldn't be the last. In the days that followed, the woman became increasingly aware of the way people saw her, not as an individual, but as a symbol of something they couldn't quite place, something they were uncomfortable with. She had become a test of their own prejudices, their own assumptions about what people like her were allowed to do, allowed to be. And though she had risen to the occasion, though she had fought for her seat on that plane and refused to back down, she knew that the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It was one morning, a few days after the flight, that she was walking through the city, her head held high, her dog at her side, when she overheard a conversation that stopped her in her tracks. Two women were sitting at a cafe, sipping coffee, their voices just loud enough for her to hear. One of them was gesturing towards her, the woman's eyes scanning her up and down with that same look of judgment that she had grown so accustomed to. "I saw her on the plane the other day," the woman said. "She didn't belong in first class. You know, they'll let anyone up there these days. It's ridiculous. I mean, what's next? People with dogs in the cockpit." The other woman laughed. "It's insane. It's like they've stopped caring about who actually deserves to be there. People are flying on the coattails of someone else's name. It's all about appearances, not substance." The words stung more than they should have. The woman's fists clenched at her sides, but she didn't turn around. She didn't confront them. She simply kept walking, each step echoing louder in her ears, her dog trotting quietly at her side. It wasn't the first time she had heard this kind of thing, and it wouldn't be the last, but it didn't make it any easier to bear. She could feel the weight of their words pressing against her, like an anchor pulling her down, but she refused to let them drag her under. She had worked too hard, fought too long, to let people like them, people who couldn't even fathom what it meant to be judged for the color of your skin, to be dismissed for your existence, take away her power. In the following weeks, the tension only grew. The woman received an unexpected call from the airline. It wasn't a complaint, though, as she had expected. It was an invitation for an official, meeting to discuss her experience. They claimed to be concerned about the treatment she had received, and they wanted to assure her that the airline would look into the actions of their staff. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. She had just been a number in their system, a customer to be appeased, and now they were trying to save face by pretending to care. But the truth was, they didn't care. Not really. They cared about reputation, about keeping their paying customers happy. They cared about appearances, but the woman wasn't interested in their hollow words. She knew that no amount of apologizing would change what had happened. No amount of pretending would ever make it right. She had already made up her mind. She would not let this incident be swept under the rug. She would not let their insincerity go unchallenged. It wasn't just about her now. It was about everyone who had been silenced by people like them. It was about every person who had been dismissed, overlooked, and told they didn't belong. She walked into the meeting with a calm that surprised even her. The same flight attendant who had questioned her presence was sitting at the table, her eyes flicking nervously between the woman and the airline executives, who were all wearing their most practiced smiles, trying desperately to appear professional. She could see the fear behind their eyes. They knew she wasn't going to let this go. They knew this was more than just a complaint. It was a statement. It was a demand for change. The meeting was a charade, of course. The airline apologized, offered her vouchers, promised to review their policies, but it was all just a way to placate her, to make it go away. They didn't want to address the real issue, the issue of racism, of prejudice, of the assumptions people made based solely on someone's appearance. They didn't want to confront the truth, that the world they operated in was built on a system that told people like her they didn't belong. When the meeting ended, the woman stood up, straightening her jacket, her posture unshaken, her gaze unwavering. "I don't need your apology," she said, her voice clear, cutting through the polite words they had thrown at her. "I don't need your vouchers. What I need is for you to change, for you to realize that this isn't just about me. This is about everyone who has been treated like they don't matter. You don't get to ignore us, not anymore." The executives looked at each other, but they didn't respond. They didn't know how to respond. They weren't used to being confronted with the truth in such a direct way. They weren't used to people like her demanding change, demanding respect. She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, the flight attendant called out to her. I'm sorry for how I treated you," she said, her voice softer now, a hint of remorse there. The woman paused but didn't turn back. She didn't need to hear her apology. She didn't need her pity. What she needed was to be seen. "You're not sorry for what you did," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "You're sorry you got caught." And with that, she left the room, her footsteps echoing through the hallway, the weight of everything she had just said still hanging in the air. She didn't expect them to change overnight. She didn't expect them to fix everything in one meeting. But she knew something had shifted. She had made them uncomfortable. And that discomfort was the beginning of the end of their ignorance. The battle wasn't over. It would never be over. But as she walked through that door, she knew one thing for certain. The world had seen her, and it would never be able to forget. The days following the meeting at the airline headquarters passed slowly, as though the world had been holding its breath. The woman's resolve had only grown stronger after that confrontation. There was something freeing about speaking her truth, about laying bare the ugliness she had endured her entire life, and in some way, she felt a new weight lifted off her shoulders. But it wasn't enough to simply speak out. She knew that. Her silence had been shattered, yes, but the battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the next few weeks unfolded, it became apparent that the impact of her actions was rippling outward. News of her confrontation with the airline made its way to local outlets, and while the media coverage was brief, it was enough to get people talking. Some praised her for standing up for herself, for forcing the airline to confront its deeply ingrained biases. Others, however, saw her actions as an affront to the status quo, a challenge to the order of things that made them feel comfortable, secure, unchallenged. And there were those who chose to remain silent, unsure of how to react to a situation they didn't want to acknowledge. The woman tried to ignore the headlines, the social media posts, the opinions that others had about her. She knew better than to let the noise distract her, but it was impossible to ignore the whispers that followed her wherever she went. People would glance at her in public spaces, subtly turn away when they saw her approaching, avoid making eye contact. She had become a symbol to them, and not the kind of symbol they wanted to embrace. She had expected this, of course. She had expected the discomfort, the alienation, the ridicule. But even she had underestimated the depth of it. What she hadn't prepared for was the way her own community had begun to turn on her. They weren't the ones whispering behind her back. No, they were the ones condemning her openly, making her out to be an instigator of division. "You're too loud," they said. "You're stirring up trouble where there's none. Why can't you just be grateful for what you have?" Their voices came from places she hadn't expected, from people who shared her history, her struggles, but who didn't want to confront the reality that she had exposed. One afternoon, after she had just returned from a walk in the park with her dog, she received a text from her mother. It was short, blunt, and to the point. "I saw the video. You should have handled it differently." The words stung, sharper than any insult from strangers, because they came from someone who had raised her, who had taught her to be strong, to stand up for herself. But in that moment, it felt like her mother was telling her to quiet down, to fit in, to stop making waves. The woman stood frozen, phone in hand, staring at the text. She hadn't replied. She wasn't sure what to say. How could she explain to her mother the weight of what she had done, the significance of it, the need for it? How could she explain that this was more than just a single fight in a single moment? It was a lifetime of fighting, of enduring, of being told you didn't matter. It was about more than just a flight. It was about all the flights she had never been allowed to board in life, about all the rooms she had been denied entry into, about all the spaces she had been forced to make herself small in. She set the phone down and walked to the window, staring out at the city. The streets were busy, people moving in and out of stores, cars honking in the distance, the noise of the world so loud that it drowned out her thoughts. She had never felt so alone in a crowd. Her mind wandered back to the events of that flight, the stares, the whispers, the quiet laughter that had followed her, and then the realization that she had been seen. For a moment, she had felt the weight of every single look, every judgment that had been passed her way. But then there had been that moment, the moment when the captain had approached her, when everything had shifted, when the power dynamic had been reversed, and she knew in that instant that the world would never be the same again. The fact that they had tried to erase her had only made her stronger. They had tried to make her invisible, and she had refused. The next day, she saw another article. This one was more focused on her identity than the actual incident, talking about her race, her background, her place in society, and, predictably, the article painted her as a troublemaker rather than a victim. She had read enough of these articles in her life to know the drill. They painted her as someone who had disrupted the natural order, as if her mere presence in a space designed for people like them was enough to set off a chain reaction of chaos. What made this article even more difficult to read was the fact that it had been written by a black journalist, a person who, instead of using their platform to acknowledge the deeper issues at play, had chosen to side with the status quo, to dismiss her fight as one that wasn't worth having. It stung, but it didn't surprise her. She had always known that not everyone who shared her skin color would see things the way she did. That was part of the burden of existing in a world that constantly tried to force her to make herself small. Her own people had been conditioned by years of oppression to believe that silence, obedience, and fitting in were the keys to survival. She had been taught that too. Keep your head down, don't make trouble. But there had always been something inside her that refused to accept that. The phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her best friend, Maria. She answered immediately, eager to hear a voice that wasn't judgmental, wasn't questioning her actions. "Hey," Maria said, her tone warm and comforting. "I saw the article. I saw everything. You did the right thing. Don't let them get to you." The woman smiled, but there was still a weight in her chest, a sadness that she couldn't quite shake. "It's just hard, you know. Even when I do the right thing, it feels like no one can understand why I had to do it. It feels like I'm always going to be fighting for a place at the table. Maria's voice softened. I know. But that's why what you did matters. You're making people uncomfortable. You're making them question things. You're doing what needs to be done, and maybe they don't see it now. But eventually, they will. For the first time in days, the woman felt a flicker of hope. Maria was right. This wasn't just about what happened on that flight. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. It was about pushing back against a system that wanted to ignore the lived experiences of people like her. She had always known the truth in her heart. The world would never change if people like her stayed silent, if they kept playing by the rules that had been set by those who had never had to fight for their seat. A few days later, the woman received another text message. This one was different. It was from a colleague, a woman she had worked with years ago. The message was short but to the point. I saw what you did. I've been in that exact same position. You gave me the courage to speak up. The woman felt a lump form in her throat. It was a small victory, a quiet one, but it was enough to remind her that the work she was doing was far from over, and it was worth every moment of discomfort, every glance, every judgment that came her way. As she sat in her apartment, reading the messages, watching the world continue to buzz around her, she realized something profound. She was no longer playing by anyone's rules, but her own. The fight was hers, and it was never going to be over. She was not just asking for a seat at the table. She was building her own table. And this time, no one would be able to ignore her. The world had tried to erase her, to make her invisible, to silence her. But now she was louder than ever, and it was only a matter of time before the world was forced to listen. Days turned into weeks, and the world outside continued on as if it had never noticed the tremor she had caused. The woman could feel the weight of time pressing down on her shoulders. But the moment of clarity she had found during the confrontation on the plane had not faded. Instead, it had settled deep within her, a steady flame that burned brighter with every passing moment. No longer would she allow herself to be erased, dismissed, or ignored. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about a flight or an encounter with a rude flight attendant. This was about something much bigger. This was about the fight for every person who had ever been made to feel less than, who had been told they didn't belong. This was the fight for dignity. And it was far from over. She had thought about the flight, the meeting with the airline executives, the way the world had tried to sweep the incident under the rug. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She had made them uncomfortable, yes, but that discomfort was only the beginning. She needed to make them see the truth of what she had been through, not just her, but everyone who had ever been forced to walk in her shoes. The phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Maria, her closest friend, who had stood by her through every step of this journey. You've been quiet. What's going on? I know things have been tough, but remember, this is bigger than just you. You've already started something. Don't stop now. The words stung in the most unexpected way. Maria was right, of course. This was bigger than her. She had known that from the moment she had stepped onto that plane, from the moment she had made her stand. But now, as she sat alone in her apartment, staring at the message, she felt the weight of the battle she had chosen. It wasn't just about speaking up anymore. It was about sustaining the fight, about continuing to push back against a system that had long been designed to silence her. The fight was exhausting, yes, but the silence had always been the hardest part. The silence was suffocating. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a text. It was a call. She didn't recognize the number. Hesitant, she answered. Hello? Is this Ms. Thompson? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, and the tone was formal, too formal. She immediately tensed. Yes, this is she. Who's calling? This is Sarah Madison. I'm with the media relations team at the airline. We're reaching out regarding your experience on the flight last month. Her stomach tightened. She knew what this call was about. The airline had been forced into damage control after the public backlash, and now they were coming to offer her what they thought would be an acceptable apology, some settlement, or a public statement that would make the issue go away. It was all too predictable. I'm listening, she said, her voice calm. but her pulse quickened. "We want to offer a formal apology for the way you were treated during your recent flight. We deeply regret any discomfort this may have caused, and we'd like to meet with you to discuss how we can make things right," Sarah said. The words sounded rehearsed, as if she had said them 1,000 times before. The woman didn't respond immediately. She thought about it for a moment. The apology, the empty words, the promises that would mean nothing once the cameras stopped rolling. Once the PR team did their job and swept everything under the rug. They didn't care about her. They cared about saving face. "No, thank you," she finally said, her voice steady. "You've already made your apology in private, and it was as hollow as I expected it to be. I don't need your solutions, your PR stunts, or your attempts to make me forget what happened." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We understand your frustration, but we want to do more than just apologize. We want to help. What can we do to make this right?" She scoffed. "You can't make this right. You can't undo what was done. You can't erase the years of discrimination and bias, the years of being made to feel small, like I don't belong in the places I've earned the right to be. You don't get to just make it all go away with a nice press release or a voucher." Sarah's voice softened, but it was still laced with the same rehearsed politeness. "Miss Thompson, we're genuinely trying to understand what went wrong here. We'd like to invite you to a public discussion, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns and have a real dialogue about how we can improve." The woman's mind raced. A public discussion. Another platform for them to spin their narrative. Another chance to try to control the message. She wasn't a puppet for them to control. She wasn't going to let them exploit her pain for their own gain. She had fought too hard for that. "No," she said firmly. "What you need is a reckoning, not a discussion. You need to look at the systems you've built, the systems that have allowed people like me to be invisible for far too long. I won't let you sugarcoat it with a dialogue. If you truly wanted to make it right, you'd start by acknowledging that your company, and so many others, have been complicit in perpetuating these inequalities. But I don't think you're ready for that conversation, so I'm done." She hung up the phone, the silence in her apartment louder than the noise of the call she had just ended. There was no satisfaction in it, no relief, just the realization that this fight, this journey, wasn't going to end the way she wanted it to. She wasn't going to get the apology she deserved. She wasn't going to get the acknowledgement of the harm that had been done to her. No, the world didn't work like that. But she wasn't done fighting. Days later, a news report appeared on television and online. An article about the woman's story had gone viral once again, this time with a larger following. The story was more widespread now, and as the attention grew, so did the conversations about race, about privilege, and about the deep-rooted biases that many had been content to ignore for so long. People were starting to speak out, to share their own stories of discrimination, of being overlooked and silenced, just like she had been. It was no longer just her fight. It was a fight shared by so many others who had been made to feel less than, who had been told they didn't belong. And the airline, they didn't know what hit them. Public pressure mounted, and the protests began. Passengers cancelled their flights, celebrities spoke out against the company, and an entire movement of people who had once been silent began to make their voices heard. The woman had sparked something, a fire that couldn't be put out. But for her, it wasn't about the fame, or the public attention, or even the apology. It was about something deeper. It was about finally being seen, not as a token, not as a symbol, but as a person who had fought for her right to exist in spaces that weren't meant for her. And more than that, it was about giving others the courage to stand up and be seen too. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She wasn't waiting for anyone to tell her she had the right to take up space. She was going to make her own space, and no one, no matter how many of them there were, would ever be able to take it from her. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But as she stood there, reading the headlines, hearing the voices of others rise up alongside hers, she knew one thing for sure. The world had changed, and there was no going back, and she wasn't done yet. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What did you think about the journey and the challenges faced? Have you ever experienced moments of racism in your own life? Your experiences are important, and we truly value every one of you. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can bring you more powerful stories. We appreciate your support and would love to have you as part of our community. Have a wonderful day ahead, and if you've listened all the way to the end, let us know by commenting the phrase, "I rise above," so we can see who's with us until the very last word.